introduction, and I'd like to thank the organisers of this wonderful conference for inviting me, and in particular to the superbly efficient Ivy Chan. A couple of warnings. I'm going to go through this rather quickly. My second warning is about connectivity, which isn't great on my computer. So occasionally I will freeze, but I will come back. And then the other thing I want to mention is that in conjunction with the PowerPoint, I've prepared a list of references, which I think, Ivy, can you just show people where they are?
So the reference list is uploaded to the ICGLE website, and then underneath the tab of keynote speaker, then please find Dr. Sunderland and the abstract, and then down below, then that will be the reference to the talk for today. And then open it, then you can see a lot of references recommended by Dr. Sunderland. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so I hope those are useful. Okay, so do I need to share my screen again?
Yes, you need to share the PowerPoint slides again. Thank you.
Right, okay. Right. Okay. Right, I'm going to look at 4 different issues, and these are basically to think about rather than empirical data. The first one is materials, and I'm going to spend most time talking about materials. What do we teach with? And then I'm going to look briefly at the English language. I'm going to also look at language classroom interaction and what happens in class, including what we talk about. And then last of all, the population. Who are we actually teaching? Now, I'm not looking at any new data. So I'm not going to give you wonderful new findings, but I'm going to raise what I think are still very important questions. And I think asking questions is something we should all be doing all the time. There are different threads running through this presentation. One is basically the new and the older. I'm going to be mentioning some new things, but also some older things, because I think they're still important. So really, we're going to be looking back as well as looking forward. I'm going to ask this question. Is there discrimination in the language classroom? Is there disadvantage in the language classroom? Either, both. Of whom? Who is being disadvantaged? Who's being discriminated against? And in what sense? Because I think people very often make generalizations and they don't look closely enough. They don't look in as much in a nuanced way as they should. Okay, so what I'm saying is that we need rightful complexity. We shouldn't oversimplify. We should look for complexity, which is always there and which I'm calling rightful complexity. Okay, so to start with, okay, what do we teach with? And of course, we teach still, despite the digital age, we still teach a lot with foreign language textbooks, which might look like this, or might look like this, or might look like this. And if we're talking about textbooks, we really have to recognize that we're actually talking about representation. And what do we mean by representation? When I talk about representation, I mean representation of someone or someone's. I know someone's isn't English, but we are talking about one person or several people by someone or someone's in a given medium, which might be print, digital, or image, and in a particular way. So we might have this sort of representation of a woman. We might have this sort of representation of a man. Now, the point is that these representations are not just representations of individuals. We're also talking about representations of social groups. So women, men, black people, white people, straight people, cis people, LGBTQ people, representations of social groups. And of course, textbooks are full of representations of individuals and of social groups. And so we can ask questions like this. In a given text or a given textbook, how many members are there of a given social group? X, so we can look quantitatively. But as well, we also need to look qualitatively. What are they represented as doing, as looking like, i.e. the images? What are they represented as saying? So for example, in dialogues. And of course, then we can ask, how do group X and group Y compare? Most typically in the past, how do women compare with men in terms of the way they are represented? Okay, now if we're talking about representation, we have to recognize that representation isn't random, it entails selection or choice. Somebody is actually doing the representing, and that is by selecting from a pool of possibilities, choosing from a pool of possibilities. And this selection is actually done by the text producer, who might start producing something on a screen, producer or producers, and of course they're doing it for the text consumer, who might be somebody like this. And I think this idea of selection is very important, because that is actually a choice. It's always a choice. Representation is always a choice. Okay, now the findings of materials. I'm not going to go into findings, because over and over again, there have been many, many studies, published studies. Students do these sort of studies, undergraduate students that don't get published. But a lot of findings since the 1970s, over and over again, have found very often more male than female characters. And I'm talking here about types and tokens. And by types, I imagine most people are familiar with this distinction, but the type is the particular character. So you might have Miss Wong or Miss Wong appears 20 times, that is 20 times, that's 20 tokens. So the type is the actual character, the tokens is the number of times they are referenced. Okay, so over and over again, we've had more male than female characters in both senses in textbooks, many, many findings. Another general finding that male characters tend to have a wider variety of occupational roles, and there is a lot, this sort of thing. So men do more interesting things occupationally than women, and a lot of gender stereotyping. Okay, that's a quick exemplification. I don't want to dwell on this. I do want to say that things might, oh, sorry, that's Mills and Mustafa, who's, and they're on there. I've put them on the reference list. That is an up-to-date book, a collection of work on this topic. Okay, now things may be improving. And here I'm going to mention Jackie's article, Gender Representation in Hong Kong Primary School English Textbooks, a Comparative Study. And this is an interesting study because it is comparative. And she looked at the Longman Welcome to English books, a selection of these. And so it was a popular series of primary school English language textbooks published in 1988 and a new edition in 2005, which meant that she was able to compare what happened in those 17 years. And this was actually quite encouraging. So basically, she found an increase in gender equity in the more recent books, including increased visibility of women, both visually and textually. And I think that's an important distinction. We need to look both at images and what is said in terms of representation. So that's a good thing, but there's a but. And basically, I would say there is always a but. There's always a but because of this rightful complexity that I talked about. She still found, okay, a perpetuation of some gender stereotypical images, and still found a representation of women in a more limited range of social roles than men, and also more what's called male firstness. So for example, men and women, Mr. and Mrs., rather than women and men and Mrs. and Mr. Now, women and men is equally grammatical. Mrs. and Mr. is equally grammatically correct, but there is this tradition of male firstness, and we can exemplify that with lots of other things. Okay, now to that, I would add that findings are often what we can call patchy, as you can see. So we can see improvements in some areas and not in other areas. And here I'd mention Ruby Yang's study of female and male characters, again types and tokens, and in a different primary Longman Express. And that's an example from the book. And quite interestingly, Ruby Yang found 75 male types and 74 female types, which is very good. We're not complaining about the one. But when it came to tokens, when it came to the number of times these people were actually represented, the male-female token ratio was about 1.5 to 1. So even though we had the same number of actual characters, the male characters were represented, the same male characters were represented more. So I think we always... Okay, I'm going to mention now various problems with language textbook research, and I think there are a lot of problems, and this is something I talk about quite a lot. I'm going to mention 4, and then I'm going to focus on 3. Okay, I think this is the one I'm not going to focus on, so I'll just mention it. Lack of nuance. Textbooks have got subgenres. For example, we have authentic reading texts, we have dialogues, we have grammar exercises, and often people, when they analyze language textbooks from this perspective, don't make a distinction between them. And I think it is important to make a distinction, because it may be that some subgenres are more progressive than others. Okay, often there's a lack of consideration of classroom consumption, okay, basically, which is what is done with the textbook. So use by the teacher, verbalized responses by the students, understanding by the students. It seems to me a lot of people look at textbooks, and if that textbook remains in a cupboard, so what? We really have to look at what is actually done, even though it's more complicated. And I'm going to give you an example of that. I think that's very important, not just looking at the text, but how it's actually consumed. Okay, there has been a focus on gender rather than sexuality, and I'm going to have a look at that as well. And then lastly, I'm going to look at what I'm calling the desiderata, i.e. what should happen, what should be the case with textbooks. Okay, let's look at consumption first. Okay, basically, there's a teacher teaching. My point here is you can never predict from a text what the teacher will say about it. And I think a lot of people who write about textbooks say, we've got this text, the teacher will do this, the teacher will do that. I would say, no, we don't know what the teacher is going to do with it. And an example, and I know some people here have seen it before, this is an example of a text about a wedding. And basically it's a text about a Swedish woman who marries an Indian man and talking about the fact that they had 2 weddings. And this was taught in Portugal, and a student of mine recorded it several years ago, and she recorded what the male teacher said. The male teacher decided that he would talk about weddings in general, and this is what the teacher said. He said, and the bride are white, and the bridesmaids, she will often choose the outfit for them. Usually she chooses something horrible so they don't look as good as her. Okay, now I think there's quite a lot of things we could say about this. One is that it's completely unpredictable. Okay, if you looked at that text, you would never predict in a million years that the teacher would actually say that. And of course, what's happening here is that the teacher is representing women as rather vain, petty, and jealous of other women. Now, it may well be that the teacher meant it as a joke, and possibly the teacher did think it was a joke, but it doesn't necessarily mean it was understood as a joke. But I think this makes the point very neatly that you've got the text and you've got what the teacher says, and what the teacher says is not predictable from the text itself. Okay, a quick tiny technical mention there, because we're going to have a little bit brackets simply means that the teacher is pausing, because obviously this was actually recorded and then transcribed. Okay, that's the point about consumption. The second point about textbooks, okay, is sexuality representation. And there's a fairly famous quote from Scott Thornbury: "Gayness is about as omitted from foreign language textbooks as anything can be." Now that was 1999. So let's go back and see if it was and is true. I've got a very old example, but it makes a point. This is Project English, 1985, and a very popular book all over the world with, okay, you can see it there, a lot of heterosexual two-parent families. Now, interestingly, more cases of Mrs. than Miss, and lots of Mr. and Mrs. And this is the revealing one: Mr. and Mrs. even in fantasy situations. So Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher book a holiday in space and send a postcard to Mr. and Mrs. K. Now, you think fantasy would allow for a bit more imaginative representation of relations, but no. Okay, lots of traditional images, mum, dad, children eating dinner, and no suggestion of anything other than heterosexuality. And I'm just going to mention a book which is actually on the references by Joshua Piers, which I only extreme heteronormativity. He calls it explicit heteronormativity, and I'll refer to that later. Okay, let's just move more recently. And this is a study of sexuality representation in Polish EFL textbooks. And this was work done by Łukasz Pakula, Joanne Pawelsek, and myself. And they looked at selected books from various series. Okay, different books, 6 books used to teach English in Poland. And looking at sexuality representation, and remember this is 2015, and the findings, all of the books were characterized by the omnipresence of a heteronormative lexicon regarding kinship terms, for example, husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, all in heterosexual partnerships. None of the textbooks featured any gay characters, or even, and I'm going to come back to this, even characters that could be characterized by an overtly ambiguous identity with respect to their sexuality. And I'll say more about that. Now, why does this happen? I think people probably know this. It's called the parsnips principle. And there are some parsnips, just to remind you. Parsnips here, of course, is an acronym, and it stands for politics, alcohol, religion, sex, narcotics, isms, and pork. And this is Catherine Aldridge Morris, who writes about language textbooks. And she says, basically, parsnips is a shorthand for things writers are told to avoid in their materials. Now, sexuality would fall into the sex category, I think, and the ism categories. So, for example, heterosexism. And she says it's essentially self-censorship, but if you want your book to sell, you probably need to adhere to it. Now, of course, this is relevant to international textbooks, and it may be different for locally produced textbooks. Okay, what about Hong Kong? Okay, Hong Kong, the Education Bureau has guiding principles for quality textbooks. And this was what was written in 2016. I haven't been able to find a more recent version, so I'm assuming this is a version that stands. There is not any bias in content, such as overgeneralization and stereotyping. The content and illustrations do not carry any form of discrimination on the grounds of gender, age, race, religion, culture, disability, etc., nor do they suggest exclusion. Now, what's missing? If we have a look at the line second to the bottom, etc., okay, what does that mean? Basically, sexuality is missing from this list. We can read the etc. as referring to sexuality, but I think it's vague, and I think it's interesting that it's missed out. And it would be interesting to see if these guidelines are updated, if sexuality is actually included. Okay, let's go back to the study of the Polish textbooks. And you remember I said none of the textbooks featured any gay characters, but also or even characters that could be characterized by an overtly ambiguous identity with respect to their sexuality. Now, by this we mean characters that could be read as non-heterosexual, simply because they don't, if it's not a boy with a girlfriend or a girl with a boyfriend or something like this. So let's test this and let's ask, are non-heteronormative readings possible? And this is from the Polish textbook Exam Explorer. And there are various comments in one unit. I think young people date too early, it distracts them from school. I don't mind kissing and hugging passionately in public. My parents don't approve of the person who's dating their teenage child. Now, is this non-heteronormative? Well, yes, it could be. There's nothing heterosexual about any of those. But often when we consider multimodality, something else happens. If you just have a look at those statements there, the image that goes with them is that, okay? Obviously a very heterosexual, heteronormative situation. And this is what Łukasz Bakula calls multimodal disambiguation. So it's no longer ambiguous. The ambiguity that we might welcome has been disambiguated by the image. I don't want to say that heteronormative voices are impossible. And this is another example from one of the Polish textbooks called Voices 3 on families. And this is the image we're given for families. And as you can see, these are not your standard mum, dad, boy, girl images. So the first picture, 2 young women, an older women and 2 youngish men. Picture 2 could be a single mother with 2 kids. Picture 3 could be an extended family. We can't actually say who's who. And all of them can be said to manifest what we're calling low degrees of heteronormativity, which means that different readings are possible. And basically, they all look happy. And I think that's very important in their different situations. And we can actually see this as a metaphor, as a visual metaphor for example, families with 2 same-sex parents. So there is hope, there is possibility. Okay, so is hope for change realistic given market forces? We can hedge our bets here. Is it possible that writers and publishers can actually move away from extreme heteronormativity? And I would say yes. Even despite the parsnips principle, if there's more portrayals of single parents, same-sex friends and friendship groups because they allow a range of readings. And yes, if there's fewer explicitly heterosexual interest narratives. And so here, because they would have what we're calling a lower or a lesser degree of heteronormative. And hopefully this will accompany an increase in social acceptance, which we would welcome, I hope, of social diversity more generally. Okay, my third point about textbooks is the whole desideratum question, basically what textbooks should look like as regards representation. Now, this is something else that annoys me. Often desiderata are not specified by textbook analysts who look at gender. But it seems to me, if you're critiquing something and identifying problems, you should say what you think it should be like. It's very easy to criticize. I think on top of this, we need to say what we would do instead. Now, people who do mention a desideratum, they often assume the textbook should be a reflection of reality. Should textbooks reflect reality? And often the criticism is that they're old-fashioned, they're behind reality. So, for example, Marlis Hellinger a long time ago said language teaching materials must in some way or other conform to the constitutional reality granted to women. Fair enough. But what I do want to point out are some possible problems with this reflecting reality desideratum. Which reality, whose reality? Okay, textbooks are used internationally and social and cultural contexts vary. Reality when? Times may change more quickly than textbooks are replaced. And I think people often use old textbooks, so that is true. And then again, we've got the market forces, problem with international publishers, and the parsnips problem again. Second problem with the reflecting reality desideratum, still, given the distribution of women and men in the world, we can have equal numbers, types, tokens, visuals, that may be possible. What about social and occupational roles if we reflect reality? And to put it very crudely, powerful people will still be, sadly but accurately, represented as male. So I'm just going to suggest what I call an alternative desideratum, which is basically textbook representation of the world as it could be or should be. I know this sounds very idealistic. So, of course, we'd have roughly equal numbers of male and female characters in occupational roles, or that may be a bit controversial. Do we want male midwives, etc., etc.? But of course, then again, we've got the problem of subjectivity, from whose perspective, and again, acceptability. Is it going to be acceptable to everybody? And I used to give the example of showing women driving in Saudi Arabia, because women didn't used to be allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. Now they are. But previously, that image may not have been acceptable in Saudi Arabia. And my last word on desideratum is a nice quotation from Carolyn McKinney, and she was writing on textbooks in the new South Africa. And she says, before one analyses representation of the social world in textbooks, it's necessary to determine what kind of social world it is desirable to represent. The most significant issue to consider here is to what extent textbooks should represent reality as it is, for example, the demographics of the population in relation to race, social class, gender and disability, continuing racial segregation, traditional stereotypical roles, of course, which are undesirable, and to what extent we should represent an ideal world, for example, showing equal numbers of men and women in professional roles, children of all races playing and living together. And I think that illustrates the problematic nature of the desideratum. But I still think we should actually at least consider that. I think critiquing without saying what the desideratum is a rather lazy way of doing it. Right, I'm going to move on now from materials and just look very briefly at a tiny aspect of the English language, what we teach. Now, of course, we have to teach changing language. Language always changes. We teach new coinages. So ms for women and men, women whether they're married or not. Anybody teaches mx, right, which is men and women and anybody who identifies as anything else. Now, pronouns, of course, we teach pronouns, and the pronoun I want to look at, of course, is singular they. And if we just have a look at this, this is a reference from this new book I mentioned, Joshua Piazza's Queering the Language Classroom. And if you can see that, he's got an example of how you might put pronouns on the board. And he talks about the first round pronoun, which of course has got no singular, no plural. In the second round revised pronoun, he's actually got they as both singular and plural. And of course, this is very important now, the singular they, but it's not new. It's actually not a new form. It was referenced in earlier writings. So, for example, in Thackeray's Vanity Fair, written in 1848, there is a character called Rosalind who says a person can't help their birth. She doesn't say his, she doesn't even say his or. Essentially, people were using the singular they. Now, of course, the singular they was promoted during the second wave of the women's movement as a gender-neutral alternative to the generic he, a person can't help his birth. The problem being that the generic he and other generics were found to promote the think male phenomenon. So they weren't understood as generic. They tended to be stood as male. Now, interestingly, and I'm afraid I haven't got a proper reference for this, but it comes from the corpus of contemporary American English. The singular they is increasing in use over time. Okay, so the singular they is the blue, and you can see it's increasing in use. And what's happening is that his or her is decreasing, and his is most definitely decreasing. Okay, of course, there's a relatively new emphasis with trans issues that recently, and the whole much greater stress on pronouns. So now you can get t-shirts saying my pronouns are they, them, their, themselves, themselves. And of course, so you can buy the t-shirt and wear the t-shirt if you don't want to identify as male or female, or if you simply don't like those pronouns, which you may simply from a feminist rather than a sexuality perspective. And I think it's not just a private matter. Ask about my pronouns. It's not just what you use. You want people to engage with you. She, her, they, them, he, him. So this, if you like, is a new use of singular they and them, their, etc. Also in reference to people who identify as non-binary, okay, like a gender or sexual identity is defined in terms of traditional binary oppositions such as male or female, homosexual or heterosexual. Okay, and of course, also some trans people have they as their preferred pronoun. And it's not only English. We've got an example here of German, and quite interesting. English, they, them, their. My friend is non-binary. For them, it's important to embrace their full human diversity beyond arbitrary gender roles. So that is as relevant to feminism as it is to non-binary issues. So reasons for singular they. It's an old reason, but it's still valid. Generic he is not fully generic. It's a useful gender binary people, but also it makes, and for several decades has made, the feminist point that biological sex is frequently not relevant. Whereas if we start saying he or she, we are making it relevant. Right, okay, on to my third topic. I said this was a whistle-stop tour. Okay, let's have a look at interaction. Okay, if we're talking about classroom interaction, we can talk about teacher to student, student to teacher, and student to student, very broadly. A couple of old texts, okay, and this is, well, start again. Teacher to student, teacher attention. Is it gendered in this way? And I just want to introduce to somebody who may not know, who wrote a long time ago, Dale Spender on visible women. And Dale Spender, she was concerned about research findings that teachers paid more attention to boys than to girls. And she wanted to test this in her own lessons. This was not a language class. I think this was an English literature class. So she tried to pay more attention to girls. She said, sometimes I've gone too far and have spent more time with the girls than the boys, but the tapes have proved otherwise. 10 tape lessons, the maximum time I spent interacting with girls was 42%, on average 38%, the minimum time with boys 58%. Next paragraph, most important. It's nothing short of a substantial shock doing and what I actually was doing. And I think the point, without knowing it. It sounds very idiosyncratic, but it's not. Another old study, again in the 80s, but this was a meta-analysis, which is a study of about 80 studies. And Alison Kelly, it's now beyond dispute that girls receive less of the teacher's attention in class. It applies in all age groups, several countries, various socioeconomic groupings, and all subjects. So that would include foreign languages, with both male and female teachers. The next bit of what she says is interesting too. Boys get more of all kinds of classroom interaction. The discrepancy is most marked for behavioural criticism, but boys also get more instructional contacts, more high-level questions, more academic criticism, and slightly more praise than girls. Okay, so those last sentences there are saying basically that boys get more of all sorts of good contact from the teacher, but get more of all kinds of classroom interaction, most marked for behavioural criticism, nuance and complexity. A lot of the attention is boys being told off, which can't be good for learning. Now, in my own study, and this is my PhD work a long time ago, I had a look at this question of teacher attention. This was a German class. Children were 11 or 12. And you've got the girls on the left, the boys on the right. And this was the number of times the teacher mentioned the students. And if you just have a look, it's in order. So the girl who got the most attention was Kay. She got 63 mentions. The boy, the third down, is Ken, got 65 mentions. So apart from the two top boys, Gus and Len, the girls got more or less the same amount of attention as the boys. Basically, it was Gus and Len. It was I remember two rather naughty boys who got all this attention. And if people say boys get attention, often they don't mean all the boys, they mean a small subset of boys. And that's exactly what happened here. Okay, we can talk about boys in the language classroom and boys in mixed sex language classrooms. I'll go over this rather quickly. This is an old study, and I'm not mentioning it for the findings. It's a question of, do boys actually talk more in language classrooms? And this was an old study by Julia Batters, and she found that they did, that the boys were speaking more in class. They were more dominant. Female students were dominant in attentive activities. The reason I'm mentioning this is that it's not that the boys spoke more, there was a tendency. And this is one thing I think we need to think about. I find it very annoying when people talk about gender differences, boys this, girls that. It tends to be that boys tend to do something, girls tend to do something. If we can have a look at group work in mixed sex group work in Australia. And this was Fran Munro and Janet Holmes, looking at, as I say, ESL learners. Now, they found an evenly gendered distribution of question answers, but women took more unsolicited turns. Women as a whole gave twice as much feedback. Men as a whole took twice as many turns as women, and men as a whole asked most questions. Men as a whole asked a greater proportion of response restricting questions. Now, that's a lot of data. We could say a lot about any of those. The point I'm making is, again, that it's tendencies and it's a matter of nuances. And we need to make these distinctions. We can't broadly say male students do this, female students do that. So just to sum up that little bit, what's wrong with the phrase gender differences? Doesn't allow for intra-group variation among women, among men. Doesn't allow for the all-important intergroup similarities. There will always be similarities. People sometimes have a tendency to focus on differences at the expense of similarities. It suggests two distinct groups, women are from Mars, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. We need to avoid that. It suggests fixedness and essentialism rather than change and social construction. Doesn't allow for gender fluidity. And so what I'm suggesting is we use the phrase gender tendencies. Okay, let's have a look at what happens in the classroom as regards topics. And if we're talking about topics for discussion, really, have we got an open classroom? Now, in theory, any topic is okay in the language classroom, not like other subjects. In history, we have to talk about history. In the language classroom, we can talk about anything. Speaking is one of the 4 skills, so we can utilize that. We've got lots of relevant language functions: discussing, debating, arguing, expressing a point of view, defending a point, giving reasons. Lots of useful vocabulary: reason, because, advantage, in my experience. Students discussing what they want fits in with the philosophy of communicative language teaching. So the question is, can students talk about social diversity, social inclusion? Can they talk about sexuality? Can they talk about changing gender identities? Can they talk about being cisgender or transgender? In principle, the answer is yes. In practice, I think it's likely to depend on the teaching situation. Okay, what does the British Council have to say about this? Okay, a discussion can bring out your students' interests and motivate them. It's a chance for them to talk about the things they care about. Giving and justifying opinions in English can also bring students a sense of accomplishment as they're using the language to express complex ideas. Fair enough. Discussion activities encourage critical thinking. excellent preparedness for tests like IELTS and TOEFL, which examine the ability to justify opinions. Perhaps most importantly, can be great fun for students, all fair enough. Then they have a little warning. Be careful with topics that may lead to embarrassment or offence. It's probably a good idea to steer clear of politics, religion and sex. And you can check that up. The question there is, does sex include sexual identity and sexual diversity? Does it include LGBT matters? Sorry about that. Okay, so that's something to think about in terms of topic. And then I realise I'm coming to the end. The last topic is the foreign language classroom population, which is basically who do we teach. Now, most obviously in our classrooms, we've got straight people, cis people and LGBTQI people. But rather differently, this is a different dimension of who we've got people who have to study a foreign language and people who choose to study a foreign language. And so people who choose to study a foreign language, they would include upper secondary students, they would include university students, they would include teachers. And with all these, we have in languages, we have a greater proportion of women and girls. I was supervising MA dissertations in Edinburgh University this year, and the population was about 90% female. Okay, so what's going on? If we have a look at some figures, these are from 13. These are the percentages of girls and boys who actually take French, German or Spanish if they're going on from AS level, which is when they, from being about 16 to about 17. So the figures are very small altogether, but 2.5% of girls took French, 0.9 of boys, 0.9 of girls took German, 0.5 boys, 1.9 girls Spanish, and 8% of boys. So small numbers, but the girls are the majority in all three foreign languages. So what's going on here? Coming back to the point about discrimination, we can't say girls are discriminated in this sense. Women and girls are not underrepresented like they are, say, in engineering. And they're not discriminated against. We could actually say that men and boys are subtly discriminated against. It's all very predictable. It fits in with the dominant discourse that girls are good at language and languages, and there's a sort of legacy. So in some cultural contexts, foreign languages in the past were accomplishments. So girls did painting, sewing, and French. Now, but we have to say, what about career paths? Is this all this focus on girls and language good for career paths? Okay, I've got 5 minutes. Right, okay, so let's have a look at boys. 2018, 38% of boys in England took a language at GCSE. This is age 16, 50% of girls, so quite a difference there. And particularly in French. Boys' participation being particularly low in French. Okay, there's a little clue here that in the UK, boys were more likely to continue with foreign languages in single sex than mixed sex schools. This again is an old finding. I'm not sure if it's relevant, but I think it offers a clue. So these sorts of boys are more likely to continue with the language in single sex schools. This suggests that something to do with gender is going on. So we've got something sociolinguistic rather than psycholinguistic. And there's a little clue here as well. And we can look at the construction of masculinity and femininity through a little, what I call a telling event. And this is from my data a while ago. This is the German classroom, the same one I mentioned before, 11 and 12-year-old girls, boys and girls. And in this instance, you've got the students doing pair work. They're doing pair work in single sex pairs by choice. And the teacher is alternating between girls and boys. And she wants somebody to demonstrate their dialogue. So she says, we're going to have 2 more boys, I think, with a pause. 2 more boys. What about Ray and Max? Ray and Max say no. The teacher says no. Why not? And then 2 girls say, we're boys. And 2 more girls say, we're boys. And then another girl says, we're boys, miss. And then the teacher says, all right, we'll have 2 more girls and then we'll see if the boys have got any courage. Now, nobody laughed at this and it seemed like it was normal. So I interviewed 2 boys who were actually in the class, and I'm calling them here Harry and Oliver, who may have looked like that. And I asked them, I said, if Doctor, that was the teacher, had said 2 more girls and you wanted to have a go, might you say we're girls? And they said, no. Both laughed. No? No way. And then later on, so what would have happened if you'd said we're girls or some boys had said we're girls? Oliver, the response would have been that everybody laughed their heads off. So it's like there's something wrong with being a girl for a boy, not vice versa. Partly, I think in English, girl can be an insult for a boy, so a boy wouldn't say who's a girl. But at the same time, we can see these boys of basically having boundaries of masculinity around them. And these boys were restricted by these boundaries in ways which the girls were not. And so it's like there's something wrong with being a girl, and if girls are good at languages, boys don't want to do it. And that's why the thing about single-sex schools might be relevant, because in single-sex schools, boys haven't got girls to compare themselves with. Right, so I'm just going to conclude. We've had a look at a lot of things. We've had a whistle-stop tour through various gender and sexuality issues in the language classroom. We've looked at representation, we've looked at classroom behaviour, we've looked at identification through pronouns, and we've looked at the classroom population. I think we can say as regards gender, the language classroom is a complex environment, and I mentioned the phrase rightful complexity. Who is it beneficial to? What I'm claiming is it's beneficial to students who identify as women and girls in one way, and to students who identify as men and boys in another way. And we can ask to what extent it's beneficial to gender fluid people, and of course I don't have an answer to that. I think it's clear that if we're talking about rigid gender boundaries and barriers, such as those experienced by the boys we've just seen, Ron, Roy, Max, Harry and Oliver, those boundaries cannot be helpful for these boys as foreign language learners. But at the same time, neither can lazy expectations that girls will or should be good foreign language learners, but not necessarily good at other things, that can't be helpful either. And lastly, I think we need to encourage constant reflection, constant thought and constant questioning on the part of all involved in language education. And that would include teacher educators, teachers and our students. Okay, thank you very much.